Somebody in your family has said this sentence. Maybe your grandmother, maybe a doctor, maybe a stranger online. Type A blood, that's the European blood type. 4 words that sound like fact. 4 words that have been repeated for over 100 years, and 4 words that are about to fall apart in front of you. Because when scientists actually mapped type A blood across the entire planet using real population data, real genetics, real history, the results didn't just disagree with that sentence. They obliterated it. The population with the highest concentration of type A blood anywhere on Earth isn't European. It isn't even close to Europe, and once you hear who it actually is, you're never going to repeat that old sentence again. Stick around. Because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly who invented this myth, why they invented it, which population on Earth actually holds the crown, and what the real story of your own blood type actually says about you. If you like watching myths like this, get taken apart piece by piece, subscribe right now, because that's the entire mission of this channel. Let's start with the crime scene, because that's really what this is. Vienna. A scientist named Karl Landsteiner is mixing blood samples in his lab, trying to solve a mystery that had been killing patients for decades. Why do some blood transfusions save a life and others kill instantly? His answer changed medicine forever. Blood isn't one substance, it comes in types. A, B, A, B, O. He won a Nobel Prize for it, deservedly. But here's where it turns dark. 19 years later, in 1919, a husband and wife research team, Ludwig and Hanke Hirschfeld, are stationed near a war-torn front in Macedonia. Around them, soldiers and refugees from a dozen nations: French, British, Russian, Vietnamese, Senegalese, Greek. They saw something nobody else had access to, a giant, chaotic, wartime sample of blood from across the world, and they used it to do something no honest scientist should ever do. They ranked human beings. They called it the Biochemical Race Index. Populations with more type A blood relative to type B were labeled more European, more evolved, more Western. Populations with more type B were labeled more Eastern, more primitive. This wasn't ancient wisdom. This wasn't deep genetic research. It was one small wartime sample, filtered through the racism of 1919, dressed up in scientific language so it would sound like fact. That's it. That's the entire birth of the myth you grew up hearing. Not DNA, not evolution, not truth. A ranking system invented by 2 people near a battlefield over 100 years ago. So here's the real question. When modern scientists went back with real data, decades of global genetic surveys, population after population, continent after continent, did the type A equals European theory survive? It didn't just fail. It collapsed in the most spectacular way possible. Yes, parts of Europe do carry high type A frequencies. Norway, Sweden, Austria. Numbers around 45 to 50%. Fine. That's real. But watch what happens the second you zoom out. Japan. If the old racist ranking were true, Japan should sit far below Europe. Instead, Japan rivals it. Nearly 40% type A, on par with entire European nations. There's no European bloodline explanation for that. None. It's simply there, deep in Japanese population genetics, completely independent of Europe. And Japan didn't just inherit the blood type. It built an entire culture around it. Dating apps that filter by blood type, personality horoscopes sold in convenience stores, claiming type A people are meticulous and anxious, type B people are chaotic and creative. None of it is backed by real psychology, but it proves something important. An entire nation built an identity around type A blood, with zero reference to Europe at all. Now brace yourself for the real reveal. The Blackfoot Confederacy, an indigenous nation from Montana and Alberta, zero connection to the myth's European storyline. And multiple studies going back decades have recorded type A frequencies in the Blackfoot population above 80%. Read that number again, 80%. That is not just higher than Norway. That is not just higher than Austria. That is higher than any population the original 1919 theory was built around. The single highest type A frequency ever recorded on planet Earth belongs to a Native American nation the myth never even accounted for. If type A were truly a European marker, this shouldn't exist. It shouldn't be possible. And yet there it is, sitting at the very top of the global rankings, completely destroying the century-old story. So what is actually going on here? Why does a Native American nation and a Northeast Asian country both crush European type A numbers? The answer reaches back further than anything the Hirschfelds could have imagined. The ABO blood group system isn't a few thousand years old. It isn't tied to the rise of European kingdoms or Asian dynasties. It's millions of years old, older than our species. Chimpanzees carry A-like blood variants. Gorillas carry B-like variants. This system existed before Homo sapiens walked the earth, before anyone crossed a land bridge, before anyone built a city, before anyone had a nationality to claim. Which means carrying type A blood was never a badge of recent European ancestry. It's a fossil, a genetic fossil, inherited from deep in our evolutionary past, then shuffled and locked in by something scientists call the founder effect. When a small group of people breaks away and settles a new region, whatever blood types that small group happened to carry become the dominant blood types of every future generation in that population, regardless of what continent they end up on, regardless of what the myth wants to claim. That's exactly how the Blackfoot Nation ends up with the highest type A frequency on the planet, not European ancestry. A founder effect locked in tens of thousands of years ago with zero connection to Europe whatsoever. And once you start looking, the pattern shows up everywhere the myth never accounted for. Go south into Central and South America among indigenous populations descended from the earliest migrations across the Bering Land Bridge. Here you find the opposite extreme, populations that are almost universally type O, with type A and type B nearly absent altogether, Peru, Bolivia, parts of the Amazon, blood type O approaching and in some isolated groups reaching 100%. Not because these populations lack diversity, because a small founding population crossed into an empty continent carrying almost exclusively the O variant, and every descendant for thousands of years inherited that same narrow genetic starting point. That's the founder effect again, this time producing the opposite extreme from the Blackfoot. Go north instead, to Iceland. Settled just over 1,000 years ago by a small founding population of Norse and Gaelic settlers, then isolated by ocean for centuries. Icelandic. Blood type frequencies still carry the genetic fingerprint of that original small founding group, distinct in measurable ways from mainland Scandinavia, despite obvious shared ancestry. Isolation locks patterns in. It doesn't matter whether that isolation happens on a Pacific island, an Arctic island, or the North American plains. The mechanism is identical everywhere on Earth. Now go to the Sahel and West Africa. Populations across Nigeria and neighboring regions show type A frequencies that directly overlap with parts of Europe, in some surveys exceeding them. Meanwhile, right inside Europe itself, the Basque population of northern Spain and southern France, one of the most ancient genetically distinct groups in Europe, with a language unrelated to any other on Earth, shows unusually low type A and unusually high type O, breaking the European pattern from within Europe's own borders. Let that sink in. The myth doesn't even hold up inside Europe. And here's a detail that makes the whole biochemical race index even more disturbing once you know it. This wasn't just a forgotten academic paper that quietly disappeared. Ideas like the Hirschfeld's race index fed directly into the racial pseudoscience that European fascist movements leaned on in the following decades. A ranking system built to sort populations from more evolved to more primitive based on a blood test. is exactly the kind of tool a regime looking to justify hierarchy would want to seize on. The myth wasn't just wrong. It was dangerous. And it still gets repeated today by people who have no idea where it actually came from, stripped of that history, shrunk down into a piece of harmless-sounding dinner table trivia. It was never harmless. It just got rebranded as harmless once the original context faded from memory. Let's go even further, because there's another blood marker people confuse with all of this, and untangling it makes the real picture even clearer. Rh factor, the positive or negative sign after your blood type. You've probably heard that Rh negative blood is the rare, mysterious European bloodline, sometimes even wrapped in stranger internet claims about ancient origins. Here's the actual data. Rh negative frequency is genuinely higher in parts of Europe, especially concentrated among the Basque population, the same ancient isolated group that broke the type A pattern earlier in this video. But Rh negative isn't uniquely European either. It shows up at lower but real frequencies across North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of South Asia. Once again, a trait that looks like a tidy national marker turns out to be a scattered, ancient pattern shaped by isolation and founder populations, not a clean line drawn around one continent. Now let's look at one more population because it destroys yet another version of this myth. Ashkenazi Jewish populations, historically concentrated across Central and Eastern Europe for centuries, might seem like the perfect test case for the geography determines blood type theory. And yet, genetic surveys show Ashkenazi Jewish type A and type B frequencies tracking closer to older Middle Eastern population patterns than to the surrounding European nations they lived alongside for generations. Centuries of geographic proximity to Europe didn't overwrite a deeper, older genetic signature. That's not a flaw in the data, that's the founder effect working exactly the way it always works, holding firm across centuries, regardless of which flag flew over the land a population happened to live on. Every single one of these examples points to the exact same conclusion, from completely different corners of the planet. Blood type frequency tracks migration, isolation, and deep ancestry. It does not track nationality, it never did. There's a second myth riding on the back of this first one, and it deserves to be taken apart too. You may have heard of the blood type diet, the idea that type O people should eat like ancient hunters, heavy on meat, while type A people should eat like ancient farmers, mostly plants, because blood type supposedly reflects which evolutionary stage your ancestors reached first. It sounds compelling. It has sold millions of books. And it has been tested directly, repeatedly, by nutrition scientists, and found to have no measurable basis in reality. People on these diets did sometimes see health improvements, but follow-up research showed the improvements came from cutting processed food and sugar, not from matching food to blood type. The diet worked. The blood type explanation behind it didn't. Same pattern as the European myth. A tidy story surviving long after the evidence stopped supporting it. One more stop because this one closes the loop on Europe itself. Ireland. If any nation should sit at the top of a European blood type ranking, intuition says it should be Ireland, deep in the heart of Western Europe, the exact region the original myth was supposedly describing. Instead, Ireland has one of the highest type O frequency IHS in Europe, often cited above 50%, noticeably higher than neighboring Britain and far higher than Norway or Austria. The country sitting geographically dead center of the European blood type story doesn't even carry the blood type the myth is named after in the majority of its population. If the theory can't even hold together within the one continent it was built to describe, it was never a real theory to begin with. It was a guess, dressed up as a ranking, that nobody bothered to check against Ireland, against the Basque Country, against Iceland, against any of the populations sitting right there in Europe the entire time. Now compare that to Australia, Aboriginal Australian populations, isolated on that continent for tens of thousands of years, with essentially zero external gene flow until the last few centuries, show their own distinct blood type distribution, generally dominated heavily by type O, with type A and type B present only in relatively low frequencies in most traditional communities. Another isolated founder population, another data point that has nothing whatsoever to do with Europe, and yet lines up perfectly with the same founder effect explanation driving every other example in this video. Iceland, Peru, the Blackfoot Nation, Ireland, Australia. Different continents, different histories, completely unconnected migrations, and the exact same underlying mechanism explaining all of it. That consistency is what real science looks like. A single mechanism, founder effect in isolation, correctly predicting blood type patterns everywhere on the planet, in populations that never had any contact with each other. Compare that to the 1919 Race Index, which couldn't even correctly predict the pattern within Europe itself. This is also why modern ancestry science moved away from single marker tests entirely. A blood type test looks at one gene. Modern autosomal DNA testing looks at anywhere from several 100,000 to over 1 million positions across your genome simultaneously, cross-referencing patterns against reference populations built from thousands of documented family histories. That density is what allows modern testing to distinguish, for example, Northern European ancestry from Southern European ancestry or West African ancestry from East African ancestry at a resolution a single blood type marker could never approach even in theory. One gene gives you one coin flip, inherited from ancestors going back millions of years. 1 million genetic markers give you an actual map. That's the real difference between a 100-year-old wartime myth and modern genetic science. And it's the entire reason serious researchers abandoned blood type-based ancestry claims decades ago, even while the myth kept circulating everywhere else. So here is the full, uncomfortable truth. Type A is the European blood type, was never a scientific fact. It was a wartime ranking system invented by two researchers with a small, biased sample, wrapped in scientific language to make it sound objective, and then repeated for a century because tidy stories spread faster than complicated truths. And there's one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding, because it's the closest thing to a real evidence-backed reason blood type frequencies cluster the way they do, and it has nothing to do with race. Disease. Specifically, resistance to certain infections. Researchers have found associations between blood type and susceptibility to diseases like cholera, certain strains of malaria, and even more recently, some viral infections, where one blood type shows a measurable survival advantage over another in a specific disease environment. That means in regions where a particular disease was historically brutal, natural selection could have quietly pushed a population's blood type frequency in one direction over thousands of years, favoring whichever type happened to offer better odds of survival in that specific environment. This is a real, testable, evolutionary explanation. And notice what it depends on. Local disease environment, not nationality, not race. A population living through repeated cholera outbreaks in one region and a population living through a completely different disease environment on another continent could end up with completely different blood type frequencies for reasons that have nothing to do with ancestry, lining up with modern borders. It's another mechanism alongside the founder effect, quietly shaping the map. And once again, it explains the real data far better than a wartime ranking system ever could. Put those two mechanisms together, founder effect and disease resistance, and suddenly every strange result in this video makes perfect sense. The Blackfoot Nation's extreme Type A frequency, Japan rivaling Scandinavia, the Basque Country breaking, the pattern from inside Europe, Ireland's O-heavy population sitting at the geographic center of the myth, Peruse near universal type O. Every one of those results looks like chaos if you're still holding on to the 1919 racial ranking. Every one of those results looks completely predictable the moment you understand founder effects and disease pressure instead. That's the difference between a myth and a real scientific explanation. A myth requires you to ignore the exceptions. Real science explains them. Here's what should replace it. Blood type comes from a single gene, one gene, out of roughly 20,000 in the human genome. One gene cannot tell you where your ancestors came from. It's one coin flip from millions of years ago, shaped by founder effects and genetic drift, not a passport stamp. If you actually want to trace ancestry, real science today looks at hundreds of thousands of positions across your entire genome at once. The kind of deep autosomal testing that can trace regional ancestry with real precision, distinguishing not just continent of origin, but specific regions within continents, tracking migration events going back centuries. A single blood type marker was never capable of that. It never will be. So next time someone repeats that old line, type A, that's the European blood type, you'll know exactly where it came from. 100-year-old wartime ranking system, and you'll know exactly why it's wrong. Because the highest type A frequency ever recorded on Earth belongs to an indigenous nation in North America, not a single country in Europe. That single fact should end this myth forever. It hasn't, because myths don't die from evidence. They die when enough people finally hear the real story. Consider this the moment you heard it. This is exactly what this channel exists to do. Every trait, every blood type, every physical feature carries a real history buried underneath a century of repeated myths, and almost every time, the real story is more shocking than the myth that replaced it. Comment your blood type below, right now. Tell me if you'd ever heard this myth before today, and if you want the full breakdown of type B, type O, and type AB next. The myths, the real global maps, the populations nobody expects. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because that video's coming and you don't want to miss it. One more thing before you go, because this connects everything together. Scientists didn't throw out blood type mapping entirely. They just stopped forcing it into a racial ranking. Used correctly, alongside deeper genetic markers, ABO frequency actually helped trace real human migration. Out of Africa, across Eurasia, into the Americas, out into the Pacific. Researchers studying the spread of early farming across Neolithic Europe used shifts in blood type frequency layered with other genetic markers to help map how farming populations from the Fertile Crescent gradually mixed with existing hunter-gatherer groups already living across the continent. The mistake was never noticing that blood type varies by population. That part was true. The mistake was assuming that variation matched the racial categories people already believed in, instead of following where the evidence actually pointed. That's the real lesson hiding inside this entire story. Genetics doesn't care about the borders humans draw on a map. It doesn't organize itself around nationality or the assumptions of any era's scientists. It organizes itself around migration, isolation, and time. Time scales so vast that modern racial categories don't even register. The Blackfoot Nation sitting at the top of the world's Type A rankings isn't a strange exception. It's proof the entire theory was broken from the day it was invented. Think about what that actually means for you watching this right now. If you carry Type A blood, you are not carrying a stamp that says European. You are carrying a piece of a puzzle that connects you, distantly, to Blackfoot elders in Montana, to families across Japan, to farmers who lived in the Fertile Crescent thousands of years before written history, to ancestors far older than any nation that exists today. That is a far bigger story than the one you were originally told, and it happens to be true. It's worth sitting with why a myth this shaky lasted an entire century in the first place. Part of it is that blood type is one of the only pieces of genetic information most people actually know about themselves, printed on a donor card or mentioned once by a doctor, which makes it feel personal and important, even though, biologically, it's a tiny fragment of who you are. Part of it is that the original 1919 study came wrapped in the language of hard science, published by credentialed researchers at a time when almost nobody had the tools to fact-check it against global data. And part of it is simply that nobody went looking for the Blackfoot Nation's numbers or Ireland's numbers or Japan's numbers until decades later, by which point the myth had already been repeated by enough people, in enough classrooms, enough family conversations, enough magazine articles that it no longer felt like a claim that needed checking at all. That's how myths outlive the evidence against them, not because the evidence doesn't exist, because nobody goes looking for it until someone finally puts it all in front of you, the way this video just did. So the next time somebody claims a blood type belongs to a nationality, you already know the truth. Blood type doesn't have a passport. It has a family tree that stretches back millions of years. Long before Europe, long before Asia, long before anyone on this planet had a flag to call their own. If this flipped everything you thought you knew, hit subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next video, where we're taking apart another trait you've probably been told a completely wrong story about. And if there's one thing worth carrying with you after this, let it be this. Every time a piece of trivia sounds too clean, too simple, too perfectly matched to a category humans invented, a nationality, a race, a border on a map, that's exactly the moment to get curious instead of repeating it. Real biology is messier than that. Real history is messier than that. And almost every time when you actually dig into the mess, what's hiding underneath is far more interesting than the tidy myth sitting on top of it. That's what happened with type A blood. That's what happens with trait after trait. Once you stop accepting the easy answer and start asking who actually checked it and against what data. This channel exists to keep doing exactly that, video after video, myth after myth. See you in the next one.